Ever heard of Intel? AMD? Well, of course you have. Those are your two options for CPUs, at least for x86 CPUs anyway. And they are everywhere. They are in every gaming rig and office PC and server the world over. But what if I told you that there's actually a third x86 CPU maker? Considering how fierce the litigation between Intel and AMD had to get before they finally created a patent cross-licensing agreement, full video on that in the cards above by the way, you'd be forgiven for not believing that anyone else in the entire world would be allowed to make x86 CPUs, and yet there is. The company is called Zhaoxin, a Chinese maker of x86 CPUs. This is the fascinating history of China's top CPU maker. Our story actually starts, as all CPU stories seem to, in the USA, this time with a little company called Cyrix. Cyrix was founded in Texas in 1988 from a small group of Texas Instruments employees and started, as most CPU companies seem to, by making Intel-compatible chips. Their first chip wasn't actually a CPU, but a maths coprocessor, specifically for floating point operations, aka numbers with decimal points. They called it the Fast Math, and was an 8387 pin compatible option that provided 50% more performance and consumed less power at idle too. They also designed an 8287 compatible version which came out in 1991. Their first actual CPU was a rather interesting one. Their 486 SLC and DLC models were pin compatible with the older 386 chips, offering a few 486 features like onboard L1 cache and the 486 instruction set. The 486 SLC and DLC models sat somewhere between Intel's 386 and 486 chips in terms of performance, although since the 486 SoC and DLC fit in 386 motherboards, it was more akin to Intel's overdrive chip options, where they too made pin-compatible versions of their newer processors for older motherboards. Cyrix's 486 chips were hounded for essentially false marketing, as the chip couldn't exactly live up to the performance its name suggested. They did later launch a 486 SRX2 and DRX2 chips, which were essentially double-clocked versions that finally offered proper 486 performance and were marketed as 386 to 486 upgrades. I found this datasheet advert in Farnell's archives, which is just amazing. It includes benchmark figures, installation instructions, and the brag about that in 15 minutes you can transform your 386 computer into a 486 class machine. Amazing. The following year, that being 1993, they did launch an actual 486 compatible chip, the CX486S and DX. The difference between the S and DX versions, by the way, is that DX included a floating point unit on board, whereas the S versions needed an external maths coprocessor like the Fast Math. Those were pretty late to the party though, even behind AMD's 486 chips, despite their lengthy legal battles, and benchmarked a touch slower than AMD and Intel counterparts. 1995 saw Cyrix launch the 5x86. A bit of a placeholder chip to hold off Intel's Pentium chips, as their own Pentium competitor wasn't ready for release. The 5x86 was again a drop-in replacement for a 486 chip, although since it was actually a cut-down version of their Pentium competitor M1 core, it implemented some Pentium-like features like branch prediction. I found another datasheet which details the branch prediction feature, supposedly a feature with 80% prediction accuracy, although it turned out that that feature, and a few others, were actually disabled by default due to enormous instability. You could use special software to enable them, although, especially on the earlier versions, you'd likely just make your machine completely unstable. At least Cyrix's 5x86 was a newly designed core, unlike AMD's 5x86 chip, which was just a quad multiplied clock version of their 486. The 5x86, from Cyrix anyway, didn't last long, just 6 months, as they were finally ready to launch their true Pentium competitor, the 6x86. If you've ever heard of Cyrix before, this is likely the chip you've heard of them from. The full M1 core, the full feature set and stellar performance meant that it got pretty popular. They actually named models with Pentium equivalent performance, i.e. P166+, meaning it is faster than a Pentium running at 166 MHz, despite themselves running at much lower clock speeds. Cyrix initially tried to charge a premium for that better performance, but much like AMD, their floating point performance was nowhere near as good as the Pentium, so Cyrix pivoted to offering discounted chips instead, helping them ship a bunch of units. The key problem with the 6x86, and the same issue AMD's K5 ran into, was id Software wrote Quake for the Pentium and its dual pipeline design. The Pentium could do both integer and floating point operations at the same time, which id used to their advantage by doing perspective corrections in the background while texture mapping, something that the 6x86 and AMD K5 just couldn't do, and id didn't bother to write a fallback function if the chip, the user didn't have a Pentium, nor even add a toggle to disable the feature entirely, meaning if you wanted to play Quake, you basically had to have the Pentium. That meant if you were buying or building a PC to game on, you basically bought the Pentium. Cyrix's next hit, and the thing that finally meant OEMs bought their chips, was the MediaGX, a budget all-in-one chip that integrated an aging 5x86 core, plus sound and video, all on that single chip. While it wasn't exactly fast, the idea that you could have everything built onto a single budget-friendly chip meant Compaq and Packard Bell took on Cyrix for their lowest-end computer models, such as the Presario 21 and 2200 from Compaq. Cyrix also upgraded the core to its newer 6x86 design later, and even their MMX supported cores too. The following version, MediaGXi, used their newest core design, codenamed Cayenne, with a dual-issue FPU. Basically 2 instructions per cycle can be processed rather than one at a time. Also support for AMD's 3D Now instruction set, and 256 kilobytes of on-die L2 cache, a first for Cyrix. These chips were also the last to be designed and sold by Cyrix themselves, at least fully. Why? Well, you can mostly blame Intel. Intel, not content with just being the market leader and industry innovator, spent a lot of time in the 90s suing everyone and anyone who looked sideways at their CPU designs and patents. AMD ran afoul of this anger, of course, but so did Cyrix. The catch is that Cyrix, unlike AMD, was never a true Intel second source. Cyrix never outright stole Intel's designs. They meticulously reverse-engineered everything and often went their own way when designing their cores and products, hence the discrepancy in performance, both for good and bad throughout the years. Intel saw red though and sued them anyway, although Intel actually lost that case as Cyrix was able to prove that they had just reverse-engineered the designs, but Cyrix countersued for antitrust violations, and Intel settled, giving Cyrix $12 million and a permanent license to make x86 products, so long as they were fabricated by foundries that already had an x86 license from Intel, such as IBM, SGS Thomson, now ST, and National Semiconductor. During the suits and after the MediaGXi chips launched, in late 1997, National Semiconductor merged with Cyrix becoming a wholly owned subsidiary of National. The theory was that Cyrix would now have freer access to National's fabs and resources, although That went poorly as National ran into money troubles not long after the merger. Cyrix did actually sue Intel later, claiming that Intel infringed on 3 of their own key patents, under VIA actually, for power management and registry renaming specifically, and also specifically in the Pentium Pro and Pentium 2. Intel settled that as well, giving Cyrix, now VIA, a full 10-year patent cross-licensing agreement. By 1999, National Semiconductor wanted rid of their CPU arm, having thoroughly run it into the ground by pushing Cyrix to make the lower power MediaGX style chips, and despite Cyrix having designed a whole new core, the M3 or Jalapeno, which came with out-of-order execution, a dual-issue FPU, 256 kilobytes of L2 cache, an on-die memory controller using Rambus technology, which helped the onboard GPU immensely, along with the GPU having access to that L2 cache, but it was never finished, and at least at the hands of National Semiconductor anyway. Instead, a little company called VIA bought the scraps of Cyrix for themselves, before AMD got the last of it, no less, for a cool $167 million. VIA actually started as an American company, a year before Cyrix no less, although in 1992 they decided to move the company to Taiwan to form closer relationships with the growing industry there. Initially, they focused on just making chipsets for Intel and AMD, although in 1999 they decided to branch out into CPU development, specifically x86 CPU development, as they bought both Cyrix and another x86 CPU maker called Centaur Technologies, with Centaur costing just $51 million instead. Centaur only started in 1995, funded by Integrated Device Technology, or IDT for short, and they managed to produce 2 versions of a brand new core design under the brand WinChip. These were socket 7 chips, think AMD K5 and K6, although the WinChips were a tiny little die and low power with about the same horsepower as 486. The WinChip 2 did improve a little, especially in floating point performance, but it was still a far cry from the K5 and K6 options you could have put in the same motherboards. VIA's first CPU came in 2000, which was just an altered version of the Gobi Cayenne core that they called the Cyrix 3, now codenamed Joshua. VIA, however, didn't fancy Cyrix's core designs all that much because they very quickly changed or made alternate versions of the VIA Cyrix 3, this time with Samuel cores from Centaur. Those models clocked higher at 650 and 677 MHz versus 500 and 533 MHz for the Cyrix designed cores. Only a month later though, in February 2001, VIA announced that there would be another version of the Cyrix 3, this time with Samuel 2 cores, and a new 150nm process node, or 0.15 micron. That was actually a world's first on that process node. Not that it helped performance overly, as at least according to AnandTech, the Cyrix 3, even with the fastest Samuel 2 cores, couldn't keep up with Intel's Celeron 566 and AMD's Duron 600 in any performance test, Quake 3 Arena included. And just as a final screw you to Cyrix, despite paying triple for the Cyrix name and brand as they did for Centaur, VIA renamed the Cyrix 3 to just C3. To be honest, apparently they initially picked Cyrix 3 as the name, as they believed that Cyrix, at least the Cyrix brand name, was more recognizable and popular, even above their own brands, so opted for that instead. VIA bumped the core design to Ezra, mostly as a die shrink, and added its compatibility with Intel's Pentium 3 to Latin cores, with the main design philosophy still being low power consumption. The next big core design was codenamed Nehemiah, which frustratingly was still called C3 publicly. Apparently the Linux kernel refers to this as the C3-2, which is pretty funny. VIA realized when designing this core that the chips weren't great for desktop, but they were great for embedded applications, so started to tailor the C3 and subsequent chips to that purpose. For example, having 2 onboard random number generators. One limiting factor was that the C3 was still stuck on the socket 370 motherboards, limiting their front-side bus speed to a single data rate 133 MHz, whereas their Nehemiah Plus core with a ball grid array package sported a 200 MHz front-side bus instead. By 2006, VIA's cross-licensing deal for socket 370 ended, so production of the C3 chips had to halt, although VIA pivoted to sell the C7 instead, using socket 479 or ball grid array instead. It did feature a new core UART Ester, which follows the embedded design scheme even more, offering hardware encryption and hashing support, extremely low TDP and power consumption, supposedly less than 1 watt of average power consumption with a total of 20 watts of TDP, larger L2 cache, dual PLLs for almost instant clock speed sort of switching for extreme efficiency in operation, among some other changes. VIA then pivoted to their final line, VIA Nano, starting in 2008. Nano used a new core, Isaiah, which in particular was the first x86-64 processor from VIA, aka 64-bit. Isaiah bumped the clock speeds and cache, and even added support for virtualization and ECC memory, but still with the focus on low power, high efficiency chips. The first of those were the L2000 chips, like the L2100, which the register benchmarked against a comparable Intel Atom part, and found them to be a pretty decent match. The L3000 series promised to be a 20% bump in performance and a corresponding 20% drop in power consumption, with some parts claiming an idle power consumption of just 100 milliwatts. 2011 saw VIA's first dual-core CPU, the Nano X2E, which was only 6 years behind Intel and AMD, labelled the L4000 series. You could also get a dual-die version of the Nano X2 called the Nano Quad-Core, which, funnily enough, was essentially just a glued-together, to use Intel's terms, quad-core chip. So 3 years behind on the Intel one on that. This, barring a revised version of the Nano Quad-Core in 2015, the Nano C, was all she wrote when it comes to VIA CPUs. What happened? Well, VIA entered into an agreement with the Shanghai municipal government to basically spin off their CPU division into the subject of this video, Zhaoxin, which apparently means million core. Zhaoxin was formed in 2013, and just a year later they launched their first CPUs as part of the ZX-A family. These were basically just VIA Nano X2 C4350AL chips rebranded, which isn't all that surprising considering the company is only like a year or so old. These are made with the VIA Isaiah cores and a 40nm process with clock speeds between 533 and 1066 MHz. Not exactly top performance, but that's fine. There was also ZX-B chips, which were identical, and ZX-C and C+, which are basically those Nano C VIA quad-core chips rebranded again. ZX-D, which is also where they rebranded to KX for desktop and KH for servers, is where we start to see some genuinely new work. And I'm sorry for the pronunciations across this whole video, Wudao Cow cores in here offered dual-channel DDR4 support, PCIe 3.0, USB 3.1, a full system on a chip, including graphics with DirectX 11 support built in. These K5000 chips were made with TSMC and were a significant departure from the VIA style of operation. No longer do you need the chipset to do literally everything, as now the CPU being an SoC, the memory controller, PCIe, SPI and the likes are all on board the CPU. It's a much more modern take like Intel and AMD use now and have done for a little while, to be honest. Side notes, I just love the optimization in this Hexus article, RIP Hexus. Neck and neck with AMD by 2019 is just hilarious, especially considering that this article is A, post-Ryzen, and B, from 2018. That's an awfully short time to go from something that is slower than an AMD Athlon 2 X4, and by a decent margin, according to an amazing article by Jerry that I'll link in the description, to neck and neck. Interestingly, the graphics core on board these chips and their subsequent lines are made in-house too. In 2001, VIA established a joint venture with S3 Graphics, which had a rather interesting history. They were attempting to be a graphics card maker, just like Nvidia and ATI, but failed to get any significant market share. They bought out another 90s GPU maker, Number 9, in 1999, and then almost immediately merged into Diamond Multimedia, Nvidia's first big customer no less. Video about that in the cards too. VIA created a joint venture with their GPU arm in 2001, and that's how Zhaoxin have been able to make somewhat decent quality GPUs for their CPUs. Anyway, back on the CPU front, ZX-E or the KX6000 brought another core revision, Lu Jiaozui, again sorry for the pronunciation, which brought a firm 8 cores up to 3 GHz clock speeds and slightly modified cores to better support the smaller 16nm TSMC process node they were using to manufacture the chips. A later G revision in 2022 added a Glenfly GT10C0 integrated GPU from that S3 Graphics VIA joint venture. They also launched an up to 32 core server CPU at the same time, the KH40000, which also has the option of being run dual socket for a total of 64 cores per board. That's not quite as impressive as AMD's 192 core chips, which can be run in dual socket mode as well for a whopping 384 cores and 768 threads on a single board. But still. Supposedly, these have a peak of 2.7 GHz on clock speed, up to 4 TB of ECC RAM, ECC DDR4 RAM, and have 128 PCIe lanes to go around. While benchmarks of these seem pretty limited, it seems like the KX6000G parts are likely to run at the same performance as a Core 2 Quad Q6600. Well, at least drawing considerably less power, 15 watts of TDP instead of 105. As Tom's Hardware says, they perform like CPUs from the late 2000s, but use less power. The most recent crop of chips are, you guessed it, KX7000. These have a redesigned Century Avenue core for the much smaller 7nm process node, much higher 3.7 GHz peak clock speeds, DDR5 and PCIe 4 supports, and still up to 8 cores. These were meant to launch considerably earlier, but don't seem to have started shipping until mid to late 2023, and performance is rough. A Japanese site managed to get their hands on one and compared it to even a Core i3-8100. The KX7000/8, the 8-core part, struggled, and a Ryzen 5600G just trounced it entirely. Surprisingly, even when it comes to power consumption, the KX7000 doesn't exactly amaze. The 8100 draws almost half the power, despite offering basically the same performance all-core. Even the idle power consumption is almost double both the 8100 and the 5600G, which is quite the departure from the embedded ultra-low power VIA approach. Of course, those have mostly been replaced by ARM chips for the most part, but still. Apparently their aim for this architecture is to match AMD's Zen 2 performance, that being Ryzen 3000 chips. Unfortunately, it looks like they missed the mark there quite considerably, at least looking at 8-core to 8-core parts in Cinebench, 3600 points for all-core for the KX, and 12,355 points for the Ryzen 7 3700X. It's just not quite there. Hell, even the Ryzen 3 3300X, a 4-core part, still offers basically double the performance at 6,754 points. Clearly they've got a ways to go before they're neck and neck with AMD. Oh, Hexes. Zhaoxin did also make a dedicated GPU, by putting their integrated GPU on a dedicated card with a 45W CDP and going with the same Genfly Arise GT10C0 name. With just VGA and HDMI out, a small fan and no need for anything but motherboard power, this isn't exactly a 5090 competitor, but considering it's a now fully homegrown in China part, I'm sure they're at least happy to have the option that isn't NVIDIA or AMD. Zhaoxin's development seems to be on the slower side for sure. While their chips are definitely improving, it isn't anywhere near the rate that AMD or even Intel are improving. But then again, I'm not sure that's the point. I think the point is self-reliance. Having a supplier of essentially in-house CPUs and GPUs is key for China politically, and at least on that front, it seems like they're doing alright enough. With 32-core server CPUs and 8-core desktop parts, while they don't exactly compare well to outsider options, well, the fact that they even have the option is already pretty valuable for China. For the rest of us, it seems like we will be sticking with Intel and AMD, but at least now you have some more information about the third x86 CPU market that's a maker who's actually still in business. As with all of these sort of video essay style videos, it takes a lot of work for me to do all the research and writing the scripts, and also I just really love learning about all of the interesting history and sort of how it all plays out. So if you enjoy learning this stuff as much as I do, feel free to hit the subscribe button for more of these videos. Let me know in the comments and hit the bell notification icon. You can also check out the 2 other video essay style videos that I've done on Intel and AMD and NVIDIA. Those will be in the cards above or on the end cards. And if you want to support this idiocy, feel free to check out the links in the description, including to my own open source hardware if you fancy testing monitors or peripherals. And I've actually got a new peripheral testing tool coming hopefully somewhat soon. I'm in the process of building it. It's looking pretty promising, so I'm looking forward to that one being out. But yeah, otherwise, if you have any questions, if I got anything wrong, because I am an idiot on the internet and that's likely to happen, please do let me know in the comments so we can correct it for everyone. And otherwise, yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you on the next one.